Well, I don't know about you, but I know that oftentimes it's in my greatest struggles that I really am forced to look at, do I consider God trustworthy? I love Jesus. I love following him. But in my life, do I consider him sovereign? Do I consider him trustworthy and one that I can cast all of my cares onto? So as we look at this study, we are going to be studying 1st and 2nd Kings. We're going to be looking at the Israelite people and specifically their kings to see how they relate to God, how they trust in him, and if they consider him trustworthy, and what we can learn about his character through that situation. Now, as we begin, I encourage you to read and think about, as David did in Psalm 139, verse 23. He says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts." Lisa in the study says that we are talking about 1st and 2nd Kings, but the Israelite people were a theocracy. They were led by God. So now we're in a situation where there are kings, and we're forced to look back at how we got there. And so we're actually going to jump back into 1 Samuel. Now, we talked about this earlier on this year when we did a whole study on David. But the Israelite people called out for a king. In 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 12, Samuel's talking to the people, and he says, "But when you saw Nash, king of the Ammonites, was moving against you, you said to me, 'No, we want a king to rule over us, even though the Lord your God was your king.'" God warns his people what will happen if they have a human king. He warns them of the oppression that a human king could bring. He warns them of the danger of the sin that they are committing, rejecting him as their sovereign leader. And yet, they cry out, "No, we want to be like the other nations. We want a king who we can follow and see as our tangible leader." In this study, Lisa draws a parallel that I thought that I had never thought of before. She talks about how in his trial, Jesus is compared to Barabbas. Pilate asks the crowd if he should release Jesus, and the crowd calls for Barabbas. Now, this is in all 4 Gospels, and I'm looking at the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, verse 7. "A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising." I'm not sure about you, but when I think of Barabbas, or when I have thought of Barabbas, I've thought of him as a murderer, kind of a scruffy, tough villain character. But he was part of a group of Jews who were fighting against Roman rule. They were fighting against the oppression that the Jewish people were under, and they were doing it violently. Murder, theft of the rich. Now, the Jewish people thought that the Messiah was going to rescue them from their current oppression. They thought that the leader would rescue them from the Roman rule of which they were under at the time. But the thing is, Jesus was rescuing them from so much more than they could even comprehend. He was offering them a life of freedom, an eternal life of freedom, and not just for them, but for the world. And so, because he didn't show up the way they expected, because he wasn't the heroic, violent leader who was opposing Rome, they rejected him. God's plan didn't fit with their expectations. And it causes me to consider in my own life how I have rejected God's plan or turned to my own devices, thought that a situation should be handled differently than what God clearly states. So this week, I ask you to question, to think about and ponder, what areas of your life have you chosen to take control of the situation as opposed to letting God work his sovereign way in your life, allowing him